welcome everyone to the new series of the podcast of the political science program at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. POLITalks at TAMUSA. And this is our first episode. My name is Eugen Nagy. I'm a lecturer here with the political science program in the Department of Criminology and Political Science. This podcast wants to help you get to know us better, the Department of Criminology and Political Science, and especially the political science program, and to know the faculty who teaches here, but also we want to tackle some subjects that you might be interested in. So we're going to talk about politics, we're going to talk about each other, we're going to get to know each other, the faculty, the department, and hopefully keep you engaged in terms of the topics that we will talk about. So my first guest in this first episode is my colleague, Dr. Dan Braaten, and I will let him introduce himself.
Okay, thank you, Eugene. I'm Dan Braaten, Associate Professor of Political Science here at TAMUSA in the Department of Criminology and Political Science. I am been here for 1 year, and I previously taught at Texas Lutheran University in Seguin, Texas for 10 years. That's where I was before that. Mm-hmm. So I teach international relations, comparative politics, American politics. Generally, those are the three main subfields that I teach.
Okay, but let's start from the beginning. Where are you from?
Originally, I'm from North Dakota. I grew up in the western part of the state and the eastern part of the state. There's not much to say about growing up in North Dakota. It's not much. I grew up in a very rural towns, very small towns, less than 1,000, 2,000 people. And so I went to college, undergrad at North Dakota State University in Fargo, one of the two main state schools in the state. My undergraduate BA was in political science. I had a minor in English. Then I worked for a semester at the state legislature in North Dakota as a legislative intern. And then the North Dakota legislature, like Texas legislature, meets once every 2 years in the spring. So I graduated in the fall, interned in the spring, and then I started graduate school the following spring in University of Nebraska. Mm-hmm. Fall 2003. Mm-hmm. I stayed there until 2009, and I started teaching as a visiting professor at University of Nebraska, Kearney. And then I had a series of visiting jobs.
As it usually happens?
As it usually happens,
yes.
In Kearney and Carroll University in Wisconsin. And then back at the University of Nebraska. In between that time, I led a study abroad in China.
Which we will talk about.
And then I, fall of 2013, got the job at Texas Lutheran as an assistant professor. Got tenure there, associate professor, even served as department chair for one semester, and then moved here to TAMUSA. So
yes.
It brings us up to speed.
Absolutely, in one fell swoop. Uh-huh. But let's again rewinding back, because I think it's very interesting, especially in our field, political science, which nobody knows what it is about.
No,
right?
That's true. Yeah.
So this podcast might help clarify some of these questions. So a good question to start with is, when did you first got interested in politics, especially since you grew up, like, as you said, in a rural environment, right? When does a farm boy get interested in politics?
We did live in the country, but it wasn't a farm.
Yes.
My parents, I don't remember the specific moment. It was always part of our lives. My parents are politically engaged. I get calls from them still today to talk about politics. And so they talked about it. It was always around. My parents were compulsive news watchers, local news, but also, 60 Minutes, the Sunday morning shows, all that stuff. So it's my whole life, politics was something that was in our household.
That explains it, yeah?
Pretty much. And then I always liked it. I liked history and politics are kind of my two things I was interested in. When I went to college as an undergrad, I was uncertain that I wanted to major in those because of the sort of, what am I going to do with it? Yeah. So I I was undeclared for like my freshman and sophomore year. I declared a business major. And if I had a kind of bright light moment, it was as part of the undergrad curriculum, I took an intro to political science class,
There you go.
right? And I loved it. And I knew I would, but it was, it's part of the requirements. And I also took it was called business ethics. It was really philosophy, right? And I really loved that. And when I realized it's like all my other students in the class were like, oh, we don't like this, we hate this, why do we have to take this class? And I was like, are you kidding? This is the best. And I realized I'm not in the right major. So I switched. And to placate myself, my parents were okay with it. It was more me. I was like, well, I'm going to major in political science, go to law school. That was my job. And then I had my advisor, who was one of the faculty at NDSU, she just said kind of out of the blue, like, talking about what my plans were. And she goes, you should think about graduate school. I think you'd be better at that. And that's all it took. Honestly, like that one sentence, it totally changed my plans. And that was it. So I did have those kind of, I guess I was looking for some, people telling me it's okay, to pursue this vocation. And even though it was what I always was interested in.
Indeed. I mean, you touched immediately on some crucial things. One, nobody knows what political science is until they take a class in political science. And, it's so fortunate when such classes are requirements, gen ed requirements.
Yeah, it was gen ed,
like that, because then you can try it, dip your toes, and then you say, oh, this is actually something I'm passionate about, right? Yeah. And everybody else will look at you like in wonder, like, what is wrong with you?
Right.
But that's the thing. It's it's not medicine, it's not engineering, it's not psychology. So people are so that's why it's good. I always tell my students that it's good. I'm so grateful that in Texas Texas government and federal government are required courses for all students, because beyond the civic awareness that it brings to the students, it also is a good way for them to discover that, hey, this might be something that I like. And in every single intro class, it's kind of my experience that there's about at least 5% of students who just naturally respond to this, which was your case.
Yeah.
And the second thing that you mentioned, and which I think really is important, is the importance of a faculty member who encourages you, who just opens that door, which you're there at the door, but you don't dare to knock.
Yeah, she was great. She also, my last semester, got me a research assistantship in the department, which I'm pretty sure that they never had one before. This kind of created it for me, because by then I was planning on going to grad school. So they were like, let's help you out with that. So they saw something that in me that I didn't quite have the confidence to recognize, is that no, this is probably your path, right?
Absolutely.
And so you need sometimes that outside.
Absolutely, the confirmation, someone opening slightly the door and said, "Hey, come in." And also this again also speaks to another issue, which is the importance of making connections with your faculty. And how more often than not, the faculty are happy to there's a student who actually wants to talk to me, rather than I'm sitting here at office hours and nobody's showing up. We actually want to meet students,
right? Absolutely,
and to talk to them.
Yeah, they were. It was a pretty small department, but I think it was 5 total faculty. But still, it was. She didn't have to say anything.
But that's why she was there.
Yeah, right. So that was.
What was the name of this professor?
Her name is Valerie O'Regan.
There you go. We need to mention that.
Last I knew was professor at Cal State Fullerton.
There you go. We need to mention these good teachers. They always leave a mark, right?
Yeah.
Did you have any other teachers in your life that?
Oh, yeah. The other political science faculty at NDSU. So her husband was Stephen Stambaugh. He was also a faculty at NDSU. They were originally from California, and then they moved back to Cal State Fullerton. I tell my students in Intro to International Relations, the reason I chose international relations as my area of study was I took the intro class, and I'm like, oh, this is what I want to study. And the professor there was really great too. His name's Thomas Ambrosio, and he just started my sophomore year, so he was pretty new. He's still there teaching at NDSU, and I really liked his approach. He was very, informal, but he was also like passionate. He was knowledgeable, and I can tell why I liked international relations. But it was so the subject matter, but his presentation was also really effective. So it wasn't just going to grad school; it was going to grad school for international relations, specifically.
Yeah, that was my next question. But I mean, you do teach basically, as we all do, all subfields, at least at intro level. And you also mentioned that you took that business ethics class. So would you consider political philosophy to still remain something that you're interested in?
Yeah, I like political theory, political philosophy. It's just that when grad school,
that's many
you have
hours in the day.
Yeah, right. You have to specialize in something. So I specialized in. It's funny because later on, after grad school, I've been I took a political theory class in grad school, but I've been kind of trying to fill in the backfill, all the classics since then. It's very interesting. Sometimes I feel like I want to dip my toe into that research, but I haven't and probably won't because it's.
Well, here's me encouraging you to do
it. It's very interesting. But it was just the idea of, I think the thing that really, in that business ethics, it was just like playing with ideas. Using ideas, right? And the importance of ideas and that was exciting. Right?
I think I'm not mistaken to say that given that one of your areas of interest is human rights, that's kind of at the intersection of political theory, philosophy with IR, right? Because it's about certain ideas about what is the human being, what is the value of the human being, and how does that play out in real politics.
Right. Yeah. So as an undergrad, it's took the intro to IR class, loved it, and then you take some upper division classes. I took international law, which I also really liked. We didn't have a human rights class, but just as getting the human rights information in the classes that I took, that was really when I went to graduate school, that's what I wanted to study. Also, that stemmed from a little bit of my own personal political beliefs, right? So there was an intersection in studying human rights in what I personally believe and also what I found interesting to study and teach. And when I chose my graduate school, it was based on this scholar, David Forsyth, who was one of the first people to write about human rights in the 70s. And he was at University of Nebraska. So,
I mean, what a fortunate,
Yeah, I saw him. I was thinking about this. I think I remember looking at graduate schools in a book. Because
it used to be.
Yeah, it used to be the case. But it was 2003, so I'm pretty sure I did that, but I think I looked at their rudimentary website.
Yes, me as well. Around the same time.
And I was just looking at programs trying to find it, and I was looking at the list of faculty, and I saw that. So
what they teach. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that was so human rights was personal and kind of intellectual interest.
Yeah, but that's what happens. And again, you pointed out something important that it's important to get in touch with your faculty and to establish a relationship with them while you're in undergrad or graduate school as well. But also, when you're looking to go for graduate school, go for the people who are there.
Yeah.
Not for the name of the university. And my experience was the same. I applied to several PhD programs. And I was actually, one of them, I applied for the name of the school,
right.
But then I looked into it and I talked to a professor who said, well, we actually can't help you.
That's another thing my undergrad advisor, when I decided to go to grad school, she gave me advice about that too, saying the exact same thing. Don't choose people, not the school.
Not the name,
Not the name.
Because it can be.
And she even said, okay, there's this one guy you want to work with, but make sure there's others because people leave, right?
Or things happen to them.
Right. And so I did, there were other faculty there that I wanted to work with and ended up doing. He stayed there the whole time, David Forsyth. But
so human rights is one area of interest. What other areas of interest do you have in your research?
Well, so my research has been going all over the place. So I started, my dissertation was on U.S. foreign policy and U.S. foreign policy in the development banks, how human rights influence U.S. approval or support for loans in the development banks, the World Bank, all that. So that had two of my interests, one international organizations and the other human rights. So I I still do some research on the development banks, mostly kind of the U.S. role in them. So I like international organizations. I've kind of developed some knowledge of the development banks, so I haven't got beyond that. But the development banks are the World Bank and these regional ones. And so that's one area, and I still do that. But since then, I've developed interest in two things. One's related to human rights, which is asylum, refugee issues, and now even broader migration. And then environmental politics is another issue. And both of those have stemmed from, kind of media and like what's happening in the world, right?
Yeah.
Sort of thinking of, okay, these things are happening. I want to know more about them,
Of course,
study them, start answering my own questions about them. So I'm kind of doing the international organizations, refugees, asylum, and environmental politics are good.
And this again is an important aspect here because this speaks to another strength or another advantage of a career in academia. Because why would you do that? Well, one is the teaching, right? But the other one is this pursuit of knowledge.
Yes.
Which if you just if you enjoy, if you find your the flow sensation in just learning new things, this pursuit of knowledge. This is a good place to do so. And to be able to do so is such a privileged, situation. So people who want to go for a career in the academia think of these two things. But how about teaching? Because teaching is not something you're taught.
No.
So when you first started teaching, were you a teaching assistant? Or?
Yes. So my very first semester of grad school, I was a teaching assistant for international relations intro class, and I got assigned that because that was my interest. And then I got assigned to teach teaching assistant Intro to American Politics. And then in graduate school, we had this program at Nebraska. It was called the Keller Plan. I never actually knew why it was named that, but it was basically an American politics class, intro class, that it was self-paced. So it wasn't online because there was a testing center on campus where students would just go, they'd take weekly quizzes, and it was self-paced. So you could, if you were so inclined, go through it 2 weeks. You couldn't wait till the end. There was deadlines, but you could work ahead as fast as you want. And this was the University of Nebraska, big state school, so it had 500 students every semester.
Wow.
So eventually, a graduate student was put in charge of that, and I never found out why, but I was put in charge of that, and I did it for like 2 years, and I wasn't really interested in American politics, but it was fortunate because the first visiting professor job I got because I taught American politics. And that one led to the next job and everything. Yeah. So I didn't like American politics. I was like, I'm an international relations person. I don't care about America. I don't want to talk about American politics. Since then, I've come around to enjoying it because it's also made me more interested in comparative politics, which is my secondary field. And I really only chose a secondary field because I had to. Right? I was so international relations. Like if I could have just did that one, I would have. But since then, I've grown to appreciate teaching Intro to American Government, and that is definitely the class I've taught the most. There's no question about that. But
yes, so this is how we discover if we like teaching or not, right? What was your first impression about this new task? Because again, we're not taught how to teach.
Right.
We discover new fields by teaching, right? This has happened to me as well. I discovered American government by teaching it, and I fell in love with teaching it. But how about the teaching part itself?
Yeah, so my first position was as we call them recitation section, right? So at Nebraska, it was a big lecture class, 150, 200 students. Meet 2 times a week, and then the students would meet a third time in a week with me as an instructor. And there was another professor or grad student who did it. So we'd meet these sections. We had like 4 recitation sections, just meet once a week.
Why was it called recitation?
I don't know.
Okay.
It could be breakout, it could be, but the idea was to get the small group classroom effect, right? So they would kind of get the material in the lecture, and then in the recitation classes, it was more discussion-based.
Okay, like a seminar, sort of.
Yeah. And one thing I learned quickly doing that is like, first off, I thought, okay, I don't know what to do. So I'm just going to like copy what the professor did in the regular class. And that was not the point. So I started thinking of games, simulations, any kind of thing to get them talking, right? So that was kind of the things that I would, and that was part of their grade.
To engage them with the material, yes.
It was also that they would take a weekly quiz in there. So we'd kind of talk about stuff and then give them the quiz. But yeah, I tried to, that was all about not lecturing, but about engaging. It was tough because you're just throwing it in there, right? Just saying, do this. I was just, I was only 23. Some of them were 22 probably, like some senior who hadn't taken the class. So that it was intimidating. I remember one of the older graduate students told me, something like, don't show fear, right? Like you can't let them
look the lion in the eyes.
Yeah, he said you can't let them think that you're afraid or you don't know what you're doing. And that's true.
Yeah. In the learning process.
Right. As if students think, oh, this person doesn't feel confident in what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So there was a little bit of faking it till you make it, right?
Well, which is inevitable when you're so young, right? I mean, when you're just learning the craft,
Yeah.
But that's the other thing, that you need to actually eventually like teaching, to love teaching, because that's what you do. And not everybody falls in love with that part.
Yeah. One thing I wouldn't have said this then, but it's something as I reflect back on, is I learned that teaching is also a performance.
Yeah.
So you have to engage, and I've learned to like it as a performance. It's not a stand-up comedy or anything like that. You are
sometimes.
Yeah, you are trying to, disseminate information, but you have to be engaging, and you have to, treat it like a presentation.
Yeah.
And that means, or a performance, and that means, with your whatever multimedia you want to have in it, or, those are all decisions that go into, I think, the performance of teaching.
That's an interesting point. I never thought of that specifically like this, but it's obviously part of it. I also look at it, and the reason why I find it attractive is the dialogue. Mm-hmm. The fact that you engage with someone else, that you're conversing with someone. Mm-hmm. And although I've taught this thing for a gazillion times, it makes me think of it anew. Sure, because once you enter into a dialogue, you hear new points, and I need to think about this. I never thought of it from this angle. Yeah. And for me, as a social being, but also I'm very social, it really helps to keep me stimulated, to have this ongoing dialogue, even if it's about things that I know very well.
Right. See, that's interesting, because I also realized as an introverted person that I get up to teach, but then after the class is done, I gotta decompress. If I have classes back to back, that's kind of tough.
Yes.
But and it's like I'll take a half an hour sometimes after my class, just to kind of, I don't do much. And
shockingly, faculty turned out to be also human beings.
Yeah.
I don't know.
When you think about it, one thing is like you go to graduate school to do research, which is pretty much a solo effort, right? You alone, and then most of your job is interacting with people through teaching. So, which
is beautiful, because it forces you to combine both, and I prefer this way, to be honest. And actually, I mean, you've taught at very different schools. Would you characterize them as being very different as institutions?
Oh, they did, but the schools I taught at were pretty much, there was a lot of similarities across them. Okay. And, the same issues pop up across those universities. One wasn't like one model, because I've taught at, the big state school, and the TLU where I taught for 10 years was a private liberal arts college, only 1,500 students.
Okay.
TAMUSA is kind of in the middle of that. Yeah. So it's very much like Nebraska Kearney, where I taught my first job out of grad school. So no, the students, students are students. They all have the same kind of, not issues. It's the same kind of, you got to bring them along, you got to engage, you got to, do all that stuff regardless. The difference, of course, is that class size, right? Yeah. At the large school, you would have the big lecture classes, and at this TLU, the max was like 20 students. So.
Did you notice differences between the different populations in terms of region?
Well, interesting. No, not really.
I have.
Oh, you have? I mean, I was mostly in the Midwest and Texas.
Okay.
So I don't know, culturally. If
Maybe Midwest and Texas are closer than we know.
Yeah, I haven't thought much. I mean, I nothing stands out mostly.
Okay, yeah. I like to sort of compare different cohorts in terms of years, but also regions, because I've taught in every single corner of the country.
Yeah.
And this is why I was curious. But you mentioned working with others versus researching alone, solo. Well, that's an interesting thing because it raises the question. You've published recently a book. You research it, but not alone.
No.
So how come?
A co-author.
What gives?
Yeah. My book called Bench Justice, about asylum judges or judges of asylum cases for unaccompanied minors, was written with Claire Nolasco Braaten, who from the last name
the name suggests something.
Recognizes my wife, who is a associate professor in criminology in our department. So yeah, that was written collaboratively. We have an office upstairs in our house. She sits at one end of the table. I sit at the other end of the table. And we have a child, so we have to switch babysitting duties and stuff like that. But a lot of the book was, or some of it was written like that, right? I'm working on my part over here. She's working on her part. And it makes it easier to talk about issues that come up, problems, right? I don't have to get on Zoom or email and wait. We can talk out the problems of the research right there. So that was really fun. It was. She is very task oriented and very efficient. So we started it and completed the book in less than maybe a year and a half.
That's nice.
And if it was me by myself, that would definitely not be the case.
Yep.
It was almost all thanks to her. So.
Yep. So what were because you mentioned that you each had your own tasks. So that was the methodology of working together. Was you each you distributed the tasks?
Yeah, we decided to collaborate on two things. We wanted to find an area that we both overlapped with, right? So her interest is on the legal side and also immigration, and my interest is on human rights. And methodologically, I do mostly quantitative work. And so we just sort of thought about it. And in the news, of course, lots of news about unaccompanied minors seeking asylum in the United States. So that was, we chose the topic based on its prevalence and also overlapping our research interests, because asylum, refugee rights are a human rights issue, right? So that's how we chose it, and we looked at mostly, like I said, judges, immigration judges, and then federal court judges. Methodologically, I looked at the decisions judges made, immigration judges, and there was, we had 12,000 cases or something, so that was quantitative. Federal court judges dealt with only a smaller amount of cases, 200 some cases. And so Claire did that, and her background is legal analysis, so she did it's called doctrinal analysis, sort of picking out the underlying legal issues in the specific cases to find patterns. So that's our book is divided into section 1, which is the quantitative one that I did, and then the section 2 is the legal analysis she did.
Well, let's break down the topic of the book and the subject and what you did with it for the layperson, because obviously this is a book of scientific research basically. So it goes into the weeds, right? Which is good because it's supposed to do that, but that makes it less accessible. So if you were to rephrase it, like, what is the main concern of the book?
So the main concern is twofold. One is kind of empirical, which is how judges decide.
That's excellent.
Primarily immigration judges, but also federal court judges.
What's the difference?
Well, immigration judges are appointed by the Attorney General of the United States. They only hear immigration cases. They're kind of like, you might say, judicial bureaucrat.
Administrative judges.
Administrative judges, yes. Yeah. And federal court judge is an Article III appointed judge, right? Appointed by the president, confirmed by the
federal
Senate.
judiciary.
Yes, and so they have the lifetime appointment, and they hear obviously all kinds of cases, right? So we just looked at the immigration cases. So
what's the relationship between them? How do cases from here get to there?
So you can there's appeals process, right? So you go through there's a immigration judge level. They hear the case.
What do they do?
So they hear cases about any immigration issue. We only looked at asylum claims. So that's one type of immigration visa type you can get in the United States, but there's other work visas, other things. So right. Immigration judges deal with all those. So we just isolated the asylum claims, which is one category, and only asylum for unaccompanied minors. So if you lose your case at the immigration judge level, you can appeal. This is also part of the Justice Department called Board of Immigration Appeals, which is just what it sounds.
So does it go to a federal judge?
After that, it can.
Maybe, yeah.
Yes.
But the Board of Appeals is still within the
Justice Department. It's still separate from the federal
system. Yeah.
But a case can go from the Board of Appeals, even the immigration level, to the federal courts. Generally, those are going to deal, if the case deals with a constitutional issue.
So where you get into the human rights.
Yes, and rights, procedural rights for, it's a lot of procedural and substantive rights. But human rights as well.
Yeah, because your take on it, right? I mean,
So that's the connection.
I see. Yeah. And so your concern was about children unaccompanied, because obviously this was in the news for a while everywhere, and their claims for their request for asylum. Sorry. And what happens with that?
So fundamentally, we're interested. There's a lot of research on asylum claims, refugee claims in general.
Which is a very broad subject.
Which includes anybody. There's an interesting book called Refugee Roulette, which in the title tells you, tells you kind of it's sort of random because there's immigration judges all over the courts all over the country, judges all over the country, and you hear your case is heard in Houston, you might get one outcome. Identical case heard in Los Angeles, different outcome, right? So there was that's the empirical side. What is driving that? The authors of Refugee Roulette, there's a lot of emphasis on the politics. We thought...
By which you mean partisan politics, orientation?
Partisan politics, ideological, liberals, conservatives, views on immigration, but they also looked at a lot of local context factors, which we did too, like the degree of immigrants in the population, where the court is, like these contextual things. But we thought, these are children, right? So perhaps the judges are more lenient. Really, that's kind of what I went in thinking.
Because they're children.
Because they're children, right? And that's not really the case. Right? So I was kind of interested, obviously, as a political scientist, what is the politics of immigration judicial decision making? Because they are still judges, right? And we expect judges to be impartial, apply the law to the facts. But of course, that's not the case, and that's
them
not
being
even
human beings as well.
Yeah, right. And that's not even the case at the federal courts level. But so that was kind of the driving question. And for me, or for us, mostly, it was what are the politics of unaccompanied minors' asylum decisions? And they're frankly pretty much the same as any other kind of refugee asylum decision. We looked at it over time. Things can change.
Which period?
So we looked from 1995 to 2000. One thing is that the total numbers of unaccompanied minors seeking asylum greatly increases 2014 onward.
Yeah.
It's well over double, triple the number of cases 2014 onward. Then, a couple times in the 90s, there's might be like 10 cases.
Yeah, I noticed your graphs. I saw that.
So that's one thing, and
so the 95 was the cutoff beginning, and then up to
and the only reason is that just the amount of information we got. We did a Freedom of Information Act request, and that's
so up to 2020.
We did 2020 because we didn't, in the book production process.
But that's a long period that you covered, and of course there's an increase and so
and it's
on.
weighted heavily towards the 2014.
And already you went into something I wanted to ask about. How did you get this information? And I was fascinated to learn from the book that you did a request for a Freedom of Information Act thing, which I've never done. So I'm jealous.
Well, it's surprisingly easy.
Well, but it's so fun.
This is my first time.
You, Woodward, and Bernstein.
Yeah, right. Claire did it. And it's pretty much you send an email to the department that might have it. Every federal agency has a FOIA person.
Of course, yeah.
So you send it, and
Just
then,
like they have an inspector general and so on. Yeah, yeah.
so we got that, and we realized or found later that there's a organization in Syracuse University. It's called, acronym is TRAC, Transactional Records, something. And they basically have a continuous FOIA request for information about immigration, and they publish it on their website. So we didn't even really need to do it, but
Actually,
we got
this
it
is more
anyway.
interesting
Yeah.
because you learn a new skill, you learn a
Sure,
new thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, if anybody wants information from the federal government,
Yeah.
it's
So
pretty easy.
Your main concern was the political leanings of the judges and how that influenced their decision making?
For immigration judges. And then for the federal court judges, it was more about how the federal court judges dealt with rights and constitutional issues.
Because that's their job.
Yeah, that's their job. Also, there's fewer cases there, so there's not as much ability for quantitative analysis. One thing.
So this is the doctrinal analysis that happened.
Yeah. There's interesting. There is one thing we did with the immigration judges is when somebody becomes an immigration judge, the Department of Justice will publish a blurb about them.
The bio.
All their background. So we created a variable an ideological variable about how liberal or conservative this judge is.
Which is hard.
Yeah, it's very hard. And it's not a perfect measure, but it's about their background.
Okay.
And it would have been, we probably could have done that with the federal court judges, but it would have been a lot more searching for that information. The immigration judges just had it right there available to them. So, but plus also we're looking at, since they hear a lot fewer cases at that level, we are more interested in how they deal with the rights issues, constitutional or substantive and procedural rights.
So basically you had two sets of findings, right?
Yeah.
So
yes.
what were these?
So the first finding I could summarize as immigration judges are influenced by politics in determining unaccompanied minors.
Period.
Yeah. There's a lot of context after that, but we did find there's also, depending on the politics of the county where the court is, also had an interesting impact.
So regional differences.
So there was regional differences.
Cultural that bleed into the ideological sort of.
Yeah, the idea was that an immigration judge lives in this areas, right? So they're probably influenced, or many people just live there. They have a law practice, and then maybe a lot of immigration judges were immigration lawyers, right? And so that's just a step, transition.
What is the most common background, by the way, for immigration judges, if you remember?
Well, there's two. One is federal government employment, usually working for Department of Homeland Security.
Okay.
So that could include ICE, but broadly speaking, Department of Homeland Security. So there was a lot of people in the government bureaucracy, and sometimes as prosecutors, right, of immigration violations. And then the other one is immigration lawyer, right, representing clients.
What do you think attracts them to this position? Like, I know it's not part of your research, but it's kind of an interesting.
I don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah,
Is it better paid? Is it?
I don't think so. I don't think if you want to be a rich lawyer, immigration laws.
The immigration judge is not the.
Or immigration judge could be it's a government job. It's got those kind of benefits to it. Oh, what attracts to the judges or the lawyers?
To the judges.
Oh, judges. I'm not sure. I think it's probably given their backgrounds. Like, here I am arguing these decisions. Maybe I'd like to be the one making the decisions, right? I think that's probably it. Of course, there's any kind of job like that. Your caseload, your workload is more standardized, right? You don't have to go searching for clients and all that kind of stuff. So maybe the work life of it matters.
Job security of some sort.
Yeah,
stability.
Job security.
Yeah.
So, but on the legal doctrinal side, we found that the federal courts actually create and support a lot of substantive and procedural rights for unaccompanied minors.
Meaning they're proactive to a degree?
Well, meaning that if their rights have been violated, the courts often try to rectify that.
Okay.
Not always, but there is a tendency. This is a little in the weeds, but in 1995 there was it's called a consent agreement between the federal government and the courts. So that's interesting, right? An agreement between the executive branch and the judicial branch. that said unaccompanied minors.
A written document?
Yeah. It's called a consent agreement, and the immigration bureaucracy is beholden to it.
I get it.
And it's enforced by the courts. So if they violate it, you can go to the courts, and the court will say.
So it's more like a sort of an oversight tool.
Yeah. And it's called the Flores Agreement, named after the person who is involved here. She was 15 years old, unaccompanied minor from El Salvador, I believe, and she was just held in these awful conditions, right? And the judge said, if you have an unaccompanied minor, they have to be treated a certain way, right? And that has been the courts have really tried to hold true to that going forward. Because different administrations, presidential administrations,
accountable,
yeah, they'll try to get around it. I mean, the Trump administration tried to eliminate the Flores settlement. They tried to minimize it as much as possible because it guarantees them certain. If you're being detained, and actually you can't detain them for a certain amount of time period, you have to not let them go, but there's a process where they get put into either with family members or foster care, something like that.
Yeah. Child protection, sort of.
Yeah. The Trump administration really tried to, and not. There's been other administrations that have, been better or worse on it. But so it was interesting to see the federal courts' response to that, and always pretty much slapping them down, saying, "No, you have to abide by this, right? You have to abide by this." And then there's also federal law
for the separation of powers.
There's federal law. There's the U.S. Refugee Act that applies here. There's other federal laws, Immigration Nationalization Act, that also addresses unaccompanied minors. So the federal courts are like, look, this is the law, and it's mostly against the administration because that's the immigration bureaucracy. Right? They're saying you have to follow this. So that's on the process side. Now there's the substantive side is. There's a view called, and this is in international law, the best interest of the child. Any government agency that deals with a child should do what's in the best interest of the child. Of course, that's vague, right? But that's in the International Covenant on the Rights of the Child, right? International law. Yeah. The United States has not.
Are we party to that?
No, the U.S. is the only.
That's why I'm asking.
Right, only country not party to that, but in certain policies created by administrations, they have
so to reflect some of the principles.
Yes, they have reflected that, but that's just administrative policy. New administrations come along and they can. But the one thing the courts have said is that you cannot give a child asylum based on that standard, right? So for an unaccompanied minor to get asylum, they have to meet one of the 5 criteria that's in the Refugee Act law, right, and also the Refugee Convention. So that is, on the process side, the courts are more supportive. On that substantive side, the federal courts are less so, I'd say. So that's kind of the long-winded.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. But as I'm saying, because obviously in the research you're going to tremendous detail, right? So it's good to synthesize this because this is important information. These are important findings, but. Beyond that, when you go into a subject, you always happen to find or stumble upon some things that surprise you. Yeah. What are some aspects that you didn't expect, that you learned, new things you learned or surprised you in this research?
Yeah, so whenever you do a research project, there's always like, okay, now it leads you to the next one, right?
Yeah, of course.
And for this one, there's a couple avenues we might go down. But one thing that we found interesting was the role of immigration lawyers in how that helped whether an unaccompanied minor would win asylum or not. And no surprise.
Meaning how good the lawyers are, basically?
Well, so what we looked at is if you have a lawyer or not. Because one thing about immigration law, it's an administrative process, so there's no
right to lawyer.
Sixth Amendment guarantee of the right to an attorney. Yeah. So you sometimes have children representing themselves in these immigration cases. And not just children, if it's adults too, but so if they have a lawyer or not, that's one thing we got from the data. It would also say whether person X was represented by a lawyer. And that matters. It obviously matters,
of course,
right?
Yeah.
But that was one thing we're thinking about is quality of attorneys.
Which again is a variable that it's hard to measure.
Quality is a little bit hard. I was more thinking of something about workload, burnout, experience, right? These kind of contextual factors about the quality of legal representation. So that's something.
This would be the next project, an offshoot?
I think so. We'll have to figure out how to create that. One thing we might be doing is, this might not address it directly, but we want to survey immigration lawyers who primarily deal with or have dealt with unaccompanied minors to see how they think about the case.
And about the process.
And the process, I'm sure they're all serious, right? But because they're dealing with children, is it more impactful for them? Are they trying to, quote,
burnout and so on,
do a better job? And also, does it create more burnout because they can see children not treated well? So I think I should say politics matters, but lawyers was the most impactful finding of whether a child got asylum or not. And that holds for anybody seeking asylum.
I'm sure, it can be extrapolated. That is interesting. So when was this book published? When did it come out?
September 2023.
2023. It took what, a year and a half to put it all together, and then how long that to getting the publisher and getting
that includes
includes that.
Yeah, so it's really fast. Yeah,
it was fast. How did you find the publisher?
Well, one step back is that we had written an article first.
Yeah.
So we had an article.
Which became all of the chapters.
Yeah. So we didn't start from zero. And actually,
that's a trick. That's an academic trick.
Yeah.
When you work on a book, you also produce articles.
Actually, we had 2 articles. So there was 2 chapters that were kind of based on articles. Publisher, we got just a cold request from one publisher. I think they'd saw our article, Lexington.
I know them. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
They said, "What about?" Actually, they saw another article we did about refugee resettlement in the United States. It's an interesting story how it came to that one, but we were like, well, that's not what we're working on. We're working on this thing. And they said, well, that's not what we're interested in, but they sent us to the legal team.
Okay.
And they said, yeah, we're interested. So, and then Claire put together the book proposal. And it was extremely smooth process, which I know is not always the case.
They're good. I know them, and they're good, and they're fast, and they're interested in getting good things published. Which is always good to hear.
They were really fast. They gave us a deadline. We had to extend it 1 month because we all got COVID, but that was the only kind of hiccup in the whole thing. Well, when I started it, I did have a sabbatical from Texas Lutheran.
Okay.
So that also
helped.
Right?
So back to the very beginnings, who came up with the idea?
Well, I think of me, but it was the result of a conversation.
I see.
I'm pretty sure
you've been discussing over dinner about what you were reading in the news.
Yeah. Well, we'd started first like, let's work on something together.
Okay.
So we started on finding a project, and And this was when, unaccompanied minors are still in the news, but it was one of the quote,
salient
quote waves of them. And I knew there had already been this research on refugees and asylum in general. So that area was kind of mined already. So I thought, okay, this is a different subcategory. And I knew I brought it to Claire, and she was interested in it because of her legal background and the immigration, also interested in immigration.
Also, who came up with the title? Good title.
She did.
Benched Justice, sounds good.
I had a very long, kind of just
dry,
completely descriptive title.
Yes, which is always good as the next part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, right, as a subtitle, right? And so, actually, on one of our articles, we did the title, subtitle, and the title was "Suffer the Little Children to Come." Right? So use a biblical quote, right? And so, well, we can't use that in the book, because we already used that one. So. She just came up with it, and she said, I think she'd been thinking about it for a while, and just kind of like, she's just sort of, she was thinking about it, but told me out of the blue, bench justice, and I was like,
sounds cool. It sounds very
and
cool.
Also, that's how we named our daughter. She
Benched?
not bench justice, but she thought of the name, and immediately I was like, yes.
Okay.
So when she said bench justice, I was like, yes. When she said our daughter's name. That was yes. So
which is
Olivia. She's very good at that kind
coming
of
up with some creative names. Okay, well, the immediate segue from this is how about China?
Oh,
how did you get to China? Why China?
China.
I know, and this is a completely smooth segue.
So
So you did a study abroad to China.
Yeah.
But how
as a
did you end
faculty.
up to choose China?
Okay,
Why
yeah.
China? What did you learn from that? Because it's like it wasn't something that I saw you leading to that.
No. So I got the job at Nebraska Kearney. I had not finished my PhD dissertation yet, and people said, "Well, you don't want to take it." So it was not a tenure track job, visiting job. You don't want to take a job until you finish the dissertation because it's like working at 2 full-time jobs at the same time, right? And so I was like, yeah, I get it, but I also wanted the job because it paid more than a graduate assistant.
Than not having a job.
Yeah, right. But they were right. It did extend my dissertation at least 3 years.
As it happens.
Yeah. But I got it done. But while that time I was there, I was visiting. It was meant to be just a year because I was filling in for somebody on sabbatical. And then I stayed on another semester because somebody else left on sabbatical in the same department. So I could kind of, extend it 1 semester. But then I'm like, well, this semester is going to be over.
What next?
What next? And at Nebraska Kearney, they had a study abroad office who is starting this trip to China. And they didn't have anybody to lead it. The person who was going to do it dropped out. And so I was like, well, I don't have anything to do next semester. Let me ask them. And I went to them and we worked it out. So,
was this with a partner institution there, or?
Yeah. So there was we stayed in, it's called Hubei province, which is it's about, let's say, 2 to 3 hours outside of Beijing. And there was a university there called Hubei Normal University. And I took students from Nebraska Kearney, and they took classes at that school, transferred to Nebraska Kearney. And so, from my point of view, because the previous professor was setting this up and they had to drop out, like a lot of the work was done. So I was like, yeah, I'll just, jump in.
So you were dropped into a sort of a preset, situation. So what did you learn from that experience?
Oh, tremendous amount. I learned one thing, that speaking Chinese is almost impossible for me.
Mandarin or
Mandarin.
Cantonese.
And I had so one of the classes the students had to take was the language class.
Oh.
And I was going to sit in on it. I was like, hey, this is a free Chinese language class. Like, I can't pass this up. But I stopped going after 3 weeks because
you can't pass it.
it was so hard. But I also had it was like I had a weird feeling about being a student again, right? And my identity at the time was as a professor. So,
budding, sort of growing into that.
Yeah. So I'd have regrets. It's not like had I taken that one class, I'd be fluent or anything, but it would have been worthwhile to stick it out, I think. Yeah. But so the thing that was nice is that the students took the class at that university, and we had a series of trips almost every weekend. Again, we're already arranged. Part of the program, so I just had to go with. So it was like pretty nice. Now, another class they took was the trip, so there was an experiential reflection part of it that I was responsible for.
You just didn't have to write the reflection.
Yeah, I didn't have to do it, right. So it was great. It was a great time, and I learned a lot. It was 2012, so the Party Congress where Xi Jinping became Secretary General of the Communist Party happened then.
Yeah, took power, essentially.
We were scheduled to go to Beijing that weekend, but they said no because they were worried about
security issues and
stuff. But then we went later on. So it was great. And then I got also an interest in Asian politics after that because
that's where I was leading, because that leads to something else. Plus, obviously, you now have also relationships. Sort of a foothold in the Philippines as well. Right?
Yeah, because that's where my wife
family
is from.
Connections, so to speak. You've been to the Philippines?
Yeah, been.
So
times.
How much is Asian politics part of your sort of area of interest? I mean, clearly, it matters a lot to have been there. And you see, you look at it with a different eye. Now, doesn't make it you a specialist in it, or doesn't force you to become one. But did it attract you to, okay, I should deal with this more?
So I'm interested in it mostly for teaching. Like I would like to teach an Asian politics class, or even a Chinese politics class. I've done both of those. I'd like to do those here.
I usually teach China and comparative,
Yeah. Research-wise, so Claire and I are going to start doing some research on the Philippines. We're looking at, and this is mostly driven by her, and I'm going to help out a little bit, is human trafficking, labor trafficking in the Philippines is a big issue. So we're going to look at some of that. So that would be my
labor trafficking in which direction?
Both. Well, mostly out of the Philippines, but also into the Philippines. And
from China?
Well, from all over Southeast Asia.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the other thing, is that there's kind of these, in some parts of Southeast Asia, there's these, I don't know, the term is like, they're dubious employment agencies. So they put out these social media advertisements.
Nanny or something,
Sometimes nanny, but a lot of these ones we're looking at are like call centers.
Oh, yeah.
And then
it's not.
Right, or it's catfishing, or it's high pressured sales tactics, or those kinds of things. And then when the person, so it's all over South Asia. So one we looked at in Thailand. Okay, go to Thailand for this job. You get there, they take your passport. They basically keep you in this prison, and then they tell you to exploit people online. Right, so it's this double exploitation: the worker, and then they're, catfishing somebody for money, or all those kinds of things. And the Philippines government is obviously trying to crack down on that. One thing we were looking at is the sort of, we got a database of these job advertisements, and we're going to work with someone
from there.
Yeah, Claire got them. I'm not sure where, but she got them. And we're going to work with someone in computer science, and they're going to do these text analysis because we got
to see
tons and tons
the
of
types
these
of advertisements. That
what are these advertisements that I think the Philippines government had this database of these false job advertisements. So that would be my first research area into that. But I have a rule. I would never call myself an expert on any country's politics if I didn't speak their language.
Good rule.
So I would teach Chinese politics. I know about it, but I never say I'm a China expert, because I can't speak.
I think that's good. Humility is part of wisdom.
Yeah.
Ignorance, Socratic ignorance, right?
It's a joke from, this, I think Seymour Martin Lipset, of old political scientist, said you can't claim to be an expert of a country until you've flown over it.
Oh, yes. Just flown over it.
Yeah, I didn't want to, I never wanted to claim an expertise in countries' politics unless I could understand the language. So that's also prevented me from doing some direct research on those countries, unless it's, for China, like a U.S.-China rivalry stuff, right? That's more international relations.
IR. You mentioned that you would like to teach Asian politics, and I think you will, because we are in the process of developing these courses and expanding our curriculum to cover, Asia, Europe, South America, Middle East, right? Because we need to do that, and I encourage students to look into our future course offerings. But speaking of which, do you have a dream course that you would like to offer?
Well,
maybe you've offered it already.
I have, and it's coming true because I'm going to offer it here.
Trumpets sounding, angels singing.
It'll probably won't be till like the fall or 2025 or spring of 2026. Just
they need to be scheduled,
things go. But it's international human rights class.
Awesome.
So since that is like the core,
and you speak the language.
Yeah, and I speak the language. The core subject matter I've always been interested in, and I've only taught it once.
I think the students would be very interested. It's a very interesting, attention-grabbing subject.
It'll be part of the conflict studies minor we're hoping to roll out. So that's really the class I want. Like that was like the class. No, I wouldn't say I have to prepare for at least, because it would prepare for them all. But it was the.
It's so natural.
Yeah,
really,
so it would be the most natural.
You have the most depth in it, so you just have to rearrange the boxes.
And honestly, the one when I was in grad school, that I was like, this is what I want to study and teach, right? And it is a bit, it would be an upper division IR class, so it is specialized, so it's not always applicable and all these universities and stuff. But
Yeah.
but here it will be.
Well, we talked about migration, and we talked about Asia, right? But you already, the trafficking kind of connects with the whole, refugee idea,
Oh, yeah,
asylum.
yes.
So, what do you think you've learned from this research, and in general from thinking about these issues in terms of international relations or international politics? Because these crises, that's happening right now in Burma, in all these places, there's huge crisis. So, what have you learned?
So I've been thinking a lot about not just refugee flows or labor trafficking, but migration in general.
Yeah.
Right? And
Human migration
and why people might leave. Obviously, there's many reasons.
I
right?
can tell you about that.
Yeah, but so I think, and I think there's a lot of evidence, is that migration is understudied in international relations. Right. I remember I had a econ professor in grad school. I took an econ class that said globalization is three things: flows of goods and services, flows of money, and flows of people.
Yeah.
But it's the people part that is often, he was talking about economics, but I think the same was political science, that the people one is kind of left out or marginalized, right?
Yeah.
And I think it obviously has an impact on international politics and domestic politics. We can see that here in the United States and around the world, right? But the other thing is migration is one of the fundamental things humans do, right? I mean, humans are a migratory species.
And there's various kinds of migration. It's very important because it's not all the same, or the impulses might be similar, but it's not all the same. I'm more sort of aware of it because one of my areas of study is the European Union, and there, part of the pillars of the principles, basic principles of the European Union is the free movement of goods, of persons.
People.
And without that, the other one doesn't work.
Right.
So for me, it's kind of embedded into understanding sort of the global dimension of this.
Yeah. So I think, that's if this globalization triangle or regionalization triangle, that's a third part that's often studied. It's not understudied in general, but it's more focused often on domestic politics or people migrating from country X, right? So there's not a lot of the international. And one thing maybe going forward I'm interested in is how international agreements govern refugee resettlement, but migration or don't, or why they're hard to achieve at the global level.
Or where are we in terms of everybody sort of signing up to them and so on.
And another thing, thinking about international sanctions, how sanctions on a country affect migration from that country. I read this interesting article about Venezuela in that you see a lot of Venezuelan migrants pleading asylum in the United States. And there's, just a kind of correlation is that a lot of that happened post a lot of sanctions put on them. Right? And if you're sort of U.S. policymakers,
although correlation is not always causation.
No, right, yeah. But policymakers want to, punish bad governments. But then it might trigger migration flows, which then they try to stop, right? So they're
or maybe the migrations are caused by the political developments in the country that generated the sanctions.
Yeah, right.
So there's always this.
There's
multiple,
a lot of stuff you have to tease out there for sure.
Yeah.
And that's part of also the fun part of it is to think everything's multi-causal, right? In social science, which political science is part of.
What human beings do.
What human beings do. So trying to pull it out and find not the one true cause. I don't think something like that exists, but how they relate to one another, and it's interesting.
So your next project, research project, is again together with your writing partner, so to speak.
Yeah, that's one of them.
Do you have something of your own specifically that you're thinking about?
I have a long-standing
in between the child sitting, child rearing and babysitting,
and teaching. Yeah, my first publication was with the professor I TA'd for. The very first, and we started talking about it then. David Rapkin.
Yeah.
And this was 2003, fall of 2003, spring of 2003, the U.S. and coalition invade Iraq, right? Lots in the news about a lot of stuff, but he brought this up, kept reading these things like the U.S. is losing its legitimacy, losing its at a lot of like popular publications, right?
Yeah.
So we started talking about how do we know that, right? Because a lot of it was just assertion,
Conjecture.
Right? Conjecture. And one thing we started is first we got to define this thing, legitimacy, very long-standing social science concept, right?
But very vague.
But very vague, and especially applied to the United States, not as its domestic politics, but internationally, right? And because it's...
And also measuring it from the inside is kind of a tricky thing.
Well, so what we thought is that we set out these 4 categories of what we called hegemonic legitimacy, assuming the U.S. is the hegemon,
at that point.
the most powerful state.
Yeah.
Why are countries okay or not with the U.S. being the most powerful state? So the first article was getting those definitions. And then we kind of looked at the survey data from other countries to try to... But
attitudes towards the U.S.
Yeah, but it was mostly as it says in the title, conceptual paper, right?
Yeah. Clarifying the concepts. Yeah.
Clarifying the concept. Yeah. Since then, it was published in 2009. Since then, I've always wanted to do the second part.
Which is?
Which is to measure it. So you get these concept has these dimensions, and I'll try to measure the dimensions, how they change over time.
For example?
So one of the categories would be providing global public goods or open, we call it constitutionalism. The U.S. has an open for other countries decision-making process, right? How we would define that was beyond perceptions of people in other countries. So we wanted to look at survey data of people's perceptions about how open the U.S. is. How is the U.S. doing enough, right? Now,
or too much.
Or too much, right? I can't do a survey of people in every country in the world, but the Pew Global Attitudes Project does. And unfortunately, I mean, it's a huge undertaking, right? They do it every year. Every 5 years or so, they go big. Bunch of countries, 40 countries around the world, 1,000 people in every country, all over the world. Then in the middle, they go kind of small, 10 to 15 countries, a lot in Europe. But so what I've been doing is kind of pulling these big surveys and trying to use that survey data as a measure for this legitimacy.
Do they have questions that really apply to the?
Well, that's part of the problem. They're not. If I wrote it, they would not. They're not directly how I would write it.
Well,
but I have to look what's close.
But you can apply for a grant, from the National Science Foundation, and sort of use the Pew, collaborate with them, or who knows,
Yeah, but I mean, I would like to.
Because you can't really do it on your own.
No. The one thing is because it's the global attitudes, right?
Yeah.
So you need a kind of representation of the globe, right? And that's the hard part, right? But they do surveys, and these are large scale surveys in a country. So you got language differences, and so what Pew does is they partner with the university in every one of these countries.
What's the ultimate goal of this? What are you looking for besides conceptual, which is great if you can further conceptually clarify legitimacy and then use those. Does it work? And so on.
That's kind of it. It's a puzzle, and I want to see it. I want to see if I can solve it satisfactorily.
It's also interesting because the attitudes clearly change with every major event. So Iraq War was one trend.
Yes.
End of the 90s was a different story, right?
There's a lot of one factor that I found is who's the president. Of course, that matters. Who's the U.S. president?
Yeah.
That matters for U.S. foreign policy, but it's almost so overwhelming that it might overwhelm anything
Depends
else.
On the president.
But if you go from... So Pew only started doing this in 2002 or 2001. So you got George W. Bush, 8 years, Obama 8 years, Trump 4 years, and now into Biden. And they did the 2000...
4 or 8 years with them.
Yeah, right. So they have a survey up to 2003. So you have, but from Bush it was down, Obama way up, Trump way down, Biden way up. I mean, it's not
about
a
the
huge
president,
spike.
it's about the perception of their attitude towards other countries. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm careful to stress this is perception.
Of course.
Right? And legitimacy we define in their very first international legitimacy or hegemonic legitimacy is perceptual. It's based on what people perceive. And there's a whole other work on normative legitimacy, like what is right, but we don't really address that or engage.
This
in
is
that
more fun.
yeah, so this it started in 2003. It's still in my mind. It's because I'm only working on myself, so it's always the thing that is easiest to put aside.
Yeah.
And that's and part of the thing is that I'm sort of waiting on the Pew research to
You
publish
need someone
these.
in your life who's very well organized,
Yeah.
structured.
Well, yeah, it just gets pushed off, right?
Yeah,
but
yeah,
that's the one
yeah.
thing that's it's not my white whale, so to speak, but it's always the thing it's always in the back of my mind. Right?
So, we talked about various periods in recent history because it's part of our common life. We're about the same age. And one question that I always ask the students is, well, not always, but I tend to ask the students because I like to see these changes in the, political consciousness and their self-understanding and their view of politics. One question that I like to ask them is, what is the most important political event of your life? Because each cohort is really interesting how it changes, not because of, and sometimes something that looms so large at a certain point, a few years later, for those students they will forget about that.
Sure.
And so for you, is there like a moment that sort of defined you politically, like an experience, like
me personally?
For you. Something that is like the most important political event of your life, that changes maybe, impacted you.
Two answers to that. I ask students the same thing. I kind of frame it this way: what is the first
political memory?
Political memory, yeah. And because for me, it was the Challenger explosion.
But that's what I asked you with the childhood, the sort of political inkling.
Yeah.
So that's what I was pointing out. Yeah.
And
but that was earth shattering.
Yeah.
I
was in kindergarten. And I remember this.
Did you watch it in the kindergarten?
Well, so when I went to kindergarten, we'd go every other day. Oh. And this day I was at the babysitter.
Just like the assembly.
Yeah. So this day I was at the babysitter's, and she was watching it on TV. Oh. And my mom was very excited about this because one of the astronauts was a teacher. And my mom was a teacher. And so I remember, it was exciting. It was talk.
Absolutely. It was.
And 1985.
I think it was the first civilian.
Yeah, yes. And so it wasn't just the regular old rocket or launch, right?
Yeah.
And
regular old, as if there is such a thing as a regular launch into space.
Yeah, but if people think, it's been done. But and so watching it, I have a memory of understanding that that's not supposed to happen, right? I remember my mom calling the babysitter and upset and. So that is my first.
Did you actually see it explode?
Oh yeah, it was because it was broadcast live on TV.
Yeah, I know, but it's like you maybe weren't around the TV, but you saw.
Oh no, because like I said, we were
everybody was watching.
We were watching it because it was such a big deal, and so that's my first. It's not not directly political, but it is. Yeah,
it's matters that concern the polis, right?
Yeah,
which is what politics is.
So I was like doing that, asking students that because you're right. You can track time, right? It was when I started teaching. Mostly it was 9/11, right? And then one thing that I don't know surprised me, but I guess a lot of students would say the election of Obama.
Then they said,
and then of course Trump, right?
But then they said Obama. If you ask I asked this question, and I ask the students now, what do they think the students then said?
Oh, sure, yeah.
And none of them you know what they say? The students now about the students in, let's say, 2009.
Yeah.
What they would have said. None of them says Obama. It says the economic crisis.
Okay, yeah.
Which wasn't the case with the answers at the moment. I mean, I got economic crisis at the time, but Obama looms so large.
Yeah.
And I'm just pointed out, because I like to point out to this, you see how perception, how quickly it changes. That at that point, it was the beginning and end of everything. He got the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, right away, right?
For being elected.
Yeah, pretty much. So that's interesting. It's right now.
What was the second event?
For me then I was in college, was the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So 9/11 was obviously a big event.
No, I understand.
And I remember all that clearly, where I was and everything. But the U.S. invasion of Iraq was something I felt was so obviously wrong. And yet here is the political leadership. It just felt like this
Meaning the entire political leadership.
The entire, it's just this unstoppable machine
Absolutely.
going
Congress
forward.
and executive.
And
yeah.
it so clearly seemed like the wrong thing to do. And I was always, flabbergasted and still am when I think about it. Even now it's 20 years later.
It says so much about politics, that you have a separation of powers. You have institutions who actually are meant to take different positions on issues. But the pressure of the moment was so big that you had the entire Congress, which is the House was Democrat.
Yeah, right.
Nobody cares.
Yeah, there were a lot of Democrats who supported it too.
Oh, yeah.
And so that is definitely the political memory of my life that is still. And then, frankly, so we've had a lot since. But I think part of this is what age you are.
The formative age.
So I was in college for 9/11, and I was like in the state legislature intern. I just graduated when the invasion of Iraq. Yeah. One thing, I mentioned this to students about 9/11 and trying to give them a sense of what it was like that day. I found this anecdote very interesting. I was in Fargo, North Dakota, right?
I've seen the movie.
Yeah, right. Far away from New York City and Washington, D.C. Obviously, it's happening. It's televised. And they canceled classes the rest of the day. And then I think we had them the next day, or maybe the next day was canceled too. But I remember coming back to comparative politics class, and the professor said, okay, we're just going to talk about this, which is another thing I've learned. When major events happen, I just got to throw out the lesson for today and say, all right, we got to talk about this. And this one student said, I never forget it, he goes, the terrorists won because we shut down the mall in Fargo. Like the mall in Fargo evacuated and shut down because who knows, maybe Al-Qaeda was going to hijack the plane and bomb it into the mall in the middle of nowhere, which, of course is not going to happen. But it was just, I like that as an anecdote to get the sense of how pervasive it was and how everyone was like, what is happening?
And isn't that the definition of terrorism? Is an act of violence that is supposed to create fear.
Yes, exactly. That's why I bring it up. And that's why that student was right? I mean, maybe not one long term, but
but conceptually he was correct.
Yeah, right. So
you have applied the definition, my friend.
I thought that was quite interesting. But yeah, so then that obviously a big event, but the Iraq War was the biggest political event. Yeah,
and that's the thing that I also that you keep mentioning, and I want to point out because I also try to share this with the students too, especially in political science, because again it sounds like. First, it seems like something like abstract or whatever, but the fun part of it is that it's about what human beings do. And because it's about what human beings do, we are human beings, so we can understand what they do and why they do it because, we can empathize. What would you do in that situation? So that makes it, as I always tell them, it's not chemistry or whatever where you need to learn a formula. It's human beings in action, which is also why politics and history is like, well, we're separating it because we wanna, but it's actually history is past politics.
Right, exactly.
And politics is so exactly. So that's what we have.
Yeah,
and
it's pretty arbitrary.
And this is also why I like to use various other tools in teaching to try to immerse the students, to connect them with the reality of politics, like movies and books. So do you have like movies, not that you use in class, but that for you are, let's say, political movies about politics, political movies, however you want to put it, that are, sort of stand out for you?
So
maybe use them or maybe
not. I kind of don't like movies about, say, the president or, I mean, I do, some of them are
depends
good.
How it's done, right?
Yes, but sometimes I look for my entertainment and stuff and things that are maybe not as, but that doesn't say there's some good movies like All the President's Men and stuff. But last semester I taught the comparative class using films. And the first one I showed or assigned them was a film recently came out that I feel is really, it's amazing in many ways, but it's called Women Talking.
I heard of it, yeah.
And it's fictionalized of a true event where these women are part of this exclusive religious community. In the real life, they were in Bolivia. In the fictional verse, I don't think they ever say, but it's, they're isolated religious community, right? And the men of this religious community have been, this is pretty horrific, gassing the women and then raping them in the middle of the night. And then, they would wake up and they would obviously know something was wrong, but it was all, and eventually.
Gassing and gaslighting.
Yes, right, exactly. And then so the movie starts, it's kind of this secret, and now the women started talking, and they go to this barn, and they kind of lay out, what are we going to do? Are we going to do nothing? Just go on pretending nothing happens?
Or exact revenge?
Or are we going to fight? Or are we going to leave? And when I saw that, I was like, this is exit voice loyalty, Albert Hirschman, right? He was an economist, political economist, and he was talking about how consumers respond to business. But he was saying, like, if there's and he also applied it to countries, a decline in government's doing, what do U.S. citizens do? And he kind of outlined it as 3 choices: remain loyal no matter what, leave, and then the most interesting one, I think, is voice, right? So try to say, we're not leaving, you guys got to change, or this has to change. And then
kind of is applicable to what's happening today in terms of we're in Texas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Texas is growing continuously because people from other states keep moving to Texas.
Yeah, there's that exit kind of thing, too.
Which is a reaction to perceive, whatever politics or economy and whatever, yeah.
Yeah, so it's the book is it's kind of interesting, and they don't use the term exit voice loyalty in the film, but that they kind of outline those choices. And then they say, all right, we got to find out how to decide. And then they kind of create this quasi-government where council, and then they decide on the voting procedures, right? And so it's all like
politics in action.
It's politics in action, exactly. And these concepts that were perhaps quite vague, right there.
Are embodied.
Yeah. And I find that as that was just a fascinating movie. Came out like maybe just 2 years ago.
Yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah.
That one is my number one now. It's sort of so recent. In the IR class, I always show Dr. Strangelove. So applicable.
How I learned to love the bomb.
Yeah. So those are some of them.
How about books? Do you have books about politics or political science or politics in obviously All the President's Men is about politics.
Yeah.
The book, I mean, and it's I don't know.
So the book.
That let's say a student could read with pleasure, or you have your favorite.
Yeah. So part of the thing is if the student asks I'm almost like, well, here's a lot of academic books, which is not the best thing. Like exit voice loyalty would be one I might tell somebody.
Some of them are so grabbing
of
your attention, so groundbreaking. Like I love to read some specific authors.
And that one's not bad, but I think fiction-wise, I read this in college, and it was sort of a reaffirmation of how I felt, but it's sort of been with me.
Lord of Flies.
No, not Lord of the Flies, but that is a good one to sign in IR class.
Right.
But it's The Grapes of Wrath.
The Grapes of Wrath. Yeah.
So and especially the ending, which I don't want to spoil it. Let's
not spoil it. Yeah.
However many years old, 80 years old or whatever. Yeah. But the speech by Tom Joad, for me personally, I was kind of feel like that's if I was to outline my political beliefs, if somebody asked me, what's your political beliefs? I might just say, okay, read that speech, right? Yeah. And I've always felt that that ending, that speech was, for me, how I think about politics and politics as a citizen. Is key. So and there's also politics of it's internal migration, right? It's the Dust Bowl and the people from Oklahoma moving to California, and then of course they're not welcome there, and then there's exploitation of these. So there is that kind of there's political elements to it. Even
have you read My Antonia?
Yeah, I have.
Well,
Those kind of books are pretty interesting.
Yeah. But that's why I asked, because that's the purpose of why I use books or movies, to not in the classroom actually, but sort of additionally to read while we're talking about some concepts, because these, if they're really good, unintentionally they will flesh out concepts, because if the concepts are good, they describe reality. If the movie is good, it will reflect those concepts.
I came late to reading science fiction in my life. I was, as an undergrad, I majored in political science. I thought for a little bit about majoring in English.
You had a minor in
I
English.
minored in English, but I was very much a snob. I read literature. I don't read common stuff. I've since wish I could go back in time and tell that person just chill out a little bit. But so then I've had to catch up. I've been reading lots of science fiction, and you know, there's the
Dune.
I read Dune. Dune has good interesting
it has a
stuff.
whole universe.
Yeah. The Asimov blanking, a Foundation trilogy.
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. I mean, it's about, you know, he's a psychohistorian, right? A kind of the main character is this proto-social scientist, right? So, so those are interesting. Stranger in a Strange Land. I think science fiction, because you can make it like, you can manipulate things, right? Say, okay, what would the world be like if we did this thing?
You can take concepts and really extrapolate them.
Yeah.
What if this concept would really work out this way, right?
Yeah.
So sort of take over 1984 and
yeah.
whatever.
Oh, right. Yeah. So I think science fiction is probably the best genre for political.
For playing with hypotheses.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and especially if you put it on a different planet at a different time.
Right. Yeah.
Long time ago, Star Wars.
Right. All that stuff comes into play.
Anything can happen. Yes.
That's interesting.
So we are getting close to concluding our conversation, which I greatly enjoyed, and thank you for that. But before that, tell us what you're having on on your plate right now. Meaning, if the students want to take your course with you, what are you offering? Maybe in the summer, in the fall.
In the fall, summer, just the standard of federal government.
Well, it's not that standard.
Well, yeah,
it's a great course.
Sure. In the fall, I'm offering the comparative politics class, Intro to Comparative Politics, or we call it comparative politics. The executive, about the executive branch. I like teaching that because I focus a lot on the foreign policy side.
Awesome.
And then another section of federal government. For the spring, since we're doing this curriculum revision, where those things will have to be rolled out. So for the spring, the schedule might change.
It's still developing.
Yeah,
yes.
It's still developing.
And how about, if the students want to stay in touch with you otherwise, do you have like social media? Are you present online?
I have no social media presence except for
How can you prove that you exist if you don't have a social media
except
presence?
for a long-term neglected Facebook page where I mostly now post pictures of my daughter.
LinkedIn?
For
not
friends.
present on LinkedIn?
No LinkedIn. I was on Twitter and then I got off a couple of years ago
I think
because
that's healthy.
it was not a good thing. So I've decided I'm off social media. Maybe I'll come back again.
You have an email address, which
dbraaten@tamusa.edu.
Exactly.
That's the best.
That's the best way to reach you.
Yeah.
And find you on the website. And thank you again, Dr.
Thank you.
Braaten.
It was fun.
You can actually find me on the social media. I have a YouTube channel where you can find actually many lectures in political science, and also a podcast which it will have its own series too, starting in March. So if you go on YouTube, you just Google Eugen Nagy. Well, you go on YouTube and punch my name, and I have a channel if you want to look it up. Otherwise, the next episode of this podcast of POLITalks at TAMUSA will come out in a month. So we will see you in about a month. And the plan is to have various guests, both from inside the department and from outside the department. So guest speakers, so to speak. So we are really looking forward to seeing you then there. Thank you very much.